Richard Nixon is not just the only American president to resign. He went to his grave never knowing of the prosecutor's secret allegations that destroyed his presidency. This is Watergate Revisited, an insider's view. I'm Jeff Shepard. I'm your instructor in a course entitled Watergate Revisited, an insider's view. It's being offered here at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Temple University in Philadelphia. We have a disclaimer slide. This is the 9th of 12 weekly presentations. Today's presentation is on the cover-up trial. As with everything that's presented, these are my ideas and my opinions, and everybody else denies everything. Let's do a quick review of how we got here. We started out discussing 3 surprising revelations about Watergate, that there were ex parte meetings between the judges and the prosecutors, which is a fierce no-no, that John Dean never spent any time in jail for his role, even though the public was told differently, and that Nixon, in my view, Nixon was really driven from office by secret but erroneous allegations, that he had personally approved the payment of blackmail, which the prosecutors could not show, could not prove in open court. The second week, we talked about 3 key time frames that what I think is terribly important to know about, the events surrounding the break-in and the immediate aftermath when the cover-up was planned, the events that culminated in the collapse of the cover-up, and the events that culminated in Nixon's resignation. And what the public was being told, I believe, is quite different from what was going on behind the scenes. We devoted a week to each of those 3 areas, weeks 3, 4, and 8. Just last week we did Nixon's dramatic demise. But in the interim, we did 3 important diversions. The effect of the 100% staff turnover at both the White House and the special prosecutors. I think it's terribly important. It led to our misunderstanding of the smoking gun tape on our side, but it also led to the politicalization of the prosecution and the prosecutor's loss of early knowledge of what had been going on inside the White House, inside the prosecutor's discussions with John Dean. Those were lost, and that's going to come up hugely in today's lecture. And the other items, the other 2 diversions, was the special prosecutor's 2-pronged attack on President Nixon. They were hired to prosecute, special prosecutors. But they became convinced Nixon had committed evil. They weren't going to be able to indict him. So they spent a tremendous amount of time in secret staffing the House Judiciary Committee. And that's not what was envisioned in our Constitution, but they felt it was more important to relay grand jury information in secret to the House than it was to worry about secrecy rules. And then at week 7, we talked a little bit about the hypocrisy of the Plumbers prosecution, my view that it was only brought because of the ego of the head of that task force and the need of a Harvard professor to establish a precedent against national security invasions of Americans' homes. He didn't do it when he was in office because he would have been squashed like a bug. He did it when he was on the special prosecution staff and wasn't answerable to anybody in the administration. Which brings us to today. Today is the cover-up trial. We're going to quickly review what happened on March 1st, 1974, when the indictments were announced. There were 7 people who were named defendants, John Mitchell, Bob Haldeman, and John Ehrlichman, and then lesser people, Chuck Colson, Bob Mardian, Ken Parkinson, and Gordy Strawn. After all said and done, it's only Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and Mitchell who end up being convicted after the appeals and everything else. The others are kind of drifting through but are not key. There were also 18 unindicted co-conspirators, and this enabled the prosecutors to bring in all kinds of other activities that hadn't been done by Mitchell, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman. It's important to note that the offenses that were charged were all thought crimes: conspiracy, obstruction, and perjury. My term, thought crimes. What makes them significant is the jury is asked to go inside the mind of the defendant and to make conclusions, to reach conclusions regarding the state of mind when certain actions were taken. I've used my analogy, which is pretty poor, that there's a sign on the door says you get more than 60 people, you're breaking the fire code, okay? So I can go let somebody in innocently because they're knocking on the door, or I can sneak somebody in to break the 60 rule. And it's a question of what's going on in my mind. The difficulty is if you pick a jury that doesn't like you, and if you've been subjected to 2 years of adverse publicity, the jury's tendency is to find you guilty. This isn't a current events class, but you can picture today what would happen if somebody were to be indicted in Washington, D.C., where the current president got 4% of the vote, and you asked those people to look into the minds of one of his top assistants. It complicates things. The other charge, and we'll get into it, the conspiracy charge, is very ephemeral. As Paul Marcus says in his Hornbook on the law of conspiracy, once a conspiracy has been shown to exist, adding somebody else to it requires virtually no proof at all. And we began, remember I told you there were 3 unassailable facts. There really was a break-in, there really was a conspiracy to cover up, and Nixon really did resign. Everything else is up for grabs. But if you have an admitted conspiracy, protecting yourself by saying, I wasn't a part of it, is very, very hard once the prosecutor names you. So they were, Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and Mitchell are the only ones indicted for perjury. And in the notes of Jaworski's staff, they want to know the order of the names. And he says, well, I want Mitchell first, he's Attorney General, then Haldeman, then Ehrlichman, and then the rest in alphabetical order, because they're not that important. And they signal for the jury by naming only 3 guys for perjury counts, that those are the core. Those are the people we're really after. Then the comprehensive indictment listed 45 overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy. And the fun thing about a conspiracy is we can decide we're going to break the 60 rule, more than 60 people in the room, and the gentleman over here can open the door. That's the overt act, but we're all guilty of conspiracy. Well, the prosecutor said, shoot, man, we named 45 overt acts, the vast majority of which were not committed by Haldeman, Ehrlichman, or Mitchell. They're committed by these unindicted co-conspirators, but once we get a conspiracy going, you're in for a dime, you're in for a dollar. It's an interesting way this was prosecuted. Sirica immediately, I'm in number 5 now, Judge Sirica immediately appointed himself to be trial judge, which is what we wanted, and the defendants immediately went to the Court of Appeals to try to get him kicked off because they felt he was biased, and they made 3 points in their appeal for a mandamus. Mandamus is an order from the higher court saying, no, do it our way. They said Sirica had prejudged the venue issue. Venue is where we're going to hold the trial. The defendants wanted the trial moved to Baltimore or Richmond, where it wasn't all politics all the time and they didn't have a poisoned atmosphere. And Sirica has said in one of his many public appearances that he was confident the people could get as fair a trial in D.C. as they could anyplace else. And the defendant said, nah, you prejudged the venue issue, you're biased. The other thing they wanted an evidentiary hearing to explore whether there had been any ex parte contacts between Sirica and the prosecutors. Because when they announced this roadmap that came out at the same day they did the indictment, the defendants felt that they'd been had, and they wrote a letter. Joe Wilson wrote a letter to Sirica saying, would you tell us if you'd been secretly meeting with the prosecutors? And Sirica didn't answer the letter, but on their appeal to the circuit court, they said, we want a hearing and they attached 2 newspaper articles that said Sirica had met secretly with Archibald Cox. Don't know what they said, 10 minutes at most for one of the meetings, but they said, we want to explore this in greater detail. And the third thing, they said, look, Sirica as chief judge appointed himself, but that's no fair. There's a calendar committee of 3 judges on rotation who decide who has the most time to preside over what's going to be a very extensive trial. We want the calendar committee to decide who will preside, not Sirica appointing himself. We've had experience with him before. So the circuit court did 3 things, which were really intriguing, kind of a signal of what's to come. And you have to remember, the circuit court is 9 judges, 5 of whom are a liberal bloc left over from the Kennedy-Johnson years, 4 of whom are conservatives or not liberals. One's a Southern Democrat, and 3 are Nixon appointees. So on any given randomly assigned appellate panel, because it's always 3, you could end up with 2 conservatives and a liberal. It's a roll of the dice. But if you hear the case with the whole 9 judges from the very outset, the liberals will always be in control. It's called an en banc hearing. The Supreme Court always hears cases en banc, but the circuit courts never do. And what they never, ever do is hear a case en banc from the very beginning. There's a petition for a rehearing en banc, particularly on a regulatory issue, just in the news recently, President Trump opened Arctic drilling and repealed an executive order. And while there aren't any Obama judges, an Obama judge ruled, no. Once Obama issued an executive order, it can't be repealed by another executive order because I don't want it to. He didn't say that. But well, what you would do sometimes is you would say, well, we want that to be reheard. This is just a trial judge. You go on the appeal, you get 3, you get a decision. And the loser could sometimes say, well, those 3 judges may not reflect the view of the entire panel, so out of fairness, we want a rehearing en banc. But never, because of judicial efficiency, never do you hear a case on appeal with 9 judges from the outset, sua sponte en banc. It'll be on the exam, sua sponte en banc. And never, ever, ever is that done in a criminal case because the issues are not complex. It's not a regulatory issue. Criminal law, particularly on appeal, is pretty cut and dry. We'll get to this, but since I'm in it, all 12 criminal appeals from Judge Sirica were heard sua sponte en banc. Absolutely unheard of. And very fortunately, there's a judge who's a senior judge today on the D.C. Circuit who did a law review article back in the late 1970s where he went, it's called the court en banc. And he goes through the whole history of the D.C. court and says these never happen. He didn't realize the reason it happened in the Watergate cases, and that's because Archibald Cox got so scared that Sirica's prosecution rulings were going to foul up the appeals, that he had a secret meeting with the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit and urged upon him this sua sponte en banc approach, which the court adopted. The first time they did it was on this mandamus effort to try to get Sirica kicked off the case. So we asked for the defendants asked for 3 things. Don't let Sirica come because he's already prejudged venue. Please have an evidentiary hearing on ex parte contacts because we don't think this has been fair. and please have the calendar committee assigned. Interestingly, the American Civil Liberties Union, not a friend of the Nixon administration, filed an amicus brief, friend of the court brief, in support of the second request, that if there's been ex parte meetings between the prosecutors and the judge, the defendants have a right to explore that. And what the circuit court did was rule immediately, rejected the mandamus out of hand, no opportunity for oral argument, didn't even want to have the people come in and make their arguments orally, and no opinion. It was a one-sentence order, unsigned, issued by the 5-judge majority. An astounding slap to the defendants. Okay? So that got us to the cover-up indictment. Let's go to the trial itself. It was the political show trial of the century, but of course in federal courts you can't have live TV. Sirica presided. Dean was the primary prosecution witness. Magruder, not so much. Their problem was only John Dean could connect Ehrlichman and Haldeman to the cover-up. Now, Nixon's meetings are taped, so we can argue over the tapes. And it's very clear that Dean was talking to Haldeman and Ehrlichman, but there's no memos, there's no contemporaneous record. It's he said, she said. The only possible backup for Dean is Jeb Magruder. But Jeb never met with Haldeman or Ehrlichman. And Jeb's flaky. Jeb's testified before 5 grand juries. Jeb has had 14 in-depth interviews with the prosecutors, going over facts, and Jeb doesn't remember what time it was. He's so scared that if he figures out what they want him to swear to, he'll swear to it. And there are memos that say this. The memo they've prepared for the prosecutor to walk Jeb Magruder through his direct testimony. You know, you ask him his name, he says Jeb Magruder. You ask him where he was born, he says this. It's a 50-page memo. You ask him this, he'll say that. And there's an asterisk. I think I told you this. There's an asterisk. Each time what they think he's going to say this time is going to differ from previous sworn testimony by Magruder or sworn testimony by a different government witness. We don't want this stuff coming into court where there's these conflicts. And in this 50-page memo to walk Jeb Magruder through his testimony, there are 48 asterisks. And I remember at the time, because I was around, Fred Bizart told me that the special prosecutor that was going to try James Neal had told him they weren't sure in good conscience they could put Magruder on the stand because they didn't know what he was going to say, and lots of what he might say was just going to be wrong. And they weren't sure they could do that. But they did in the end because it was Dean and they needed to get some support. So that's why it says Magruder not so much. Trial lasted 3 months. The jurors are sequestered throughout at some junky motel the government has rented for them. They can't talk to their loved ones. They can't read newspapers. They can't watch TV. And there's 12 and 2 alternates. You know, you run out of talking about your kids. It's no wonder that the verdict was achieved quite quickly. It came in on New Year's Day. They wanted to go home. Mitchell, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman are convicted on all counts, conspiracy, obstruction, and perjury. And then the other people get peeled off. Gordon Strawn is severed from the case. Ken Parkinson is acquitted. Bob Mardian's convictions reversed on appeal, never retried. Colson pleads in a different case, and he's severed from the case. The interesting one is Ken Parkinson, because the jury convicts everybody but Ken. Ken is a civil lawyer in Washington, D.C., having nothing to do with Nixon or his administration, and is retained by the committee to re-elect the president to defend them in the civil suit that the Democratic National Committee has filed against the committee to re-elect the president for damages from the break-in. And so Ken's not part of the group. And John Dean says in his book, I could never figure out why they indicted Parkinson in the first place. I can think of 5 or 6 people who were more involved than he was. And he gets this kind of reaction from the lead trial lawyer, it's a little disguised, that there's an old prosecutorial trick called mercy bait. What we do is include some poor slob who's got no reason to be in the case at all, and when the jury acquits him, we can say, see, that shows the jury distinguished between the defendants. That's Ken Parkinson. Mardian's is a different case. It's interesting. 3 weeks into the trial, Mardian's lead lawyer gets sick and has to withdraw and ultimately dies. It's not fake. You know, good idea. You could say, oh, my lawyer got sick, let me out of here. Sirica won't let him out. He says, well, he's got a young assistant. The kid's good enough. So that goes up on appeal after he's convicted. And he was just astonished when he was convicted because he only stayed a month after the break-in. His job, he didn't get the job he wanted at the re-election committee. His job for that month was to hire a lawyer to defend them in the civil suit. He hired Parkinson and he left. And he's dragged back into this case and, you know, why me? What they did on the appeal is interesting. The lead lawyer for the law firm retained to represent Mardian on appeal was the former law partner of one of the 5 liberals on the D.C. circuit. So when they took the appeal, Harold Leventhal couldn't hear it because he had an association with this other lawyer. So Mardian's appeal is separate from everybody else's. Mardian's is heard in the morning and everybody else's is heard in the afternoon, with Leventhal missing from the bench. And the partner, Leventhal's partner who's running the case on the appeal, said to this young intern who wrote the book, he says, on your arguments on appeal, don't argue on behalf of everybody. This is a political case. This is never going to be reversed. Isolate on something that only applies to Mardian, which was his lawyer. His lawyer had gotten sick. So the conviction is vacated, sent down to be retried. No retrial ever occurs. No, that's what happened to everybody. The convictions of the 3 in the cover-up case are touted as the capstone, the last chapter that proves the criminality of the Nixon administration. I mean, the guys were tried, they were convicted, upheld on appeal. The Supreme Court decided not to hear the case. So what is your complaint? And their things have stood for 40 years. If you went to look, if you had nothing better to do, you don't need to read 3 months worth of transcripts. They are kept at National Archives, and they're kept at what's called Archives 1, which is the National Archives on the Mall, because that has court records, judiciary records, and congressional records, whereas Archives 2, which is out in College Park, Maryland, has all the executive records. So if you want to see the court stuff, the briefs and the trial transcripts, they're still there. But it's thousands and thousands of pages, 3 months. So you don't have to do that. What you do is you read the defendant's briefs on appeal, where they isolate out what they think was unfair and what was wrong. And that's how you back in to the case. Well, where are our 6 people? We started out talking about these 6 people. Mitchell has been, this is on the opening day of trial. Mitchell has been acquitted in the Vesco case in New York, but he's been indicted on this case for 6 months, from March 1st to October 1st. Haldeman is under parallel investigation by the Campaign Finance Task Force because of unrelated stuff done in 1970. But it shows the top guys always have 2 task forces after them. John Ehrlichman has been convicted in the Plumbers case, and he comes into the cover-up case. They don't get along, okay? Haldeman and Ehrlichman think Mitchell caused it. Mitchell's saying, I didn't approve the Liddy plan, I had nothing to cover up. Haldeman is saying, I only served the president. I'll tell you what I did. I had no criminal intent. Ehrlichman is beside himself because his good friend Bob Haldeman didn't tell him about the taping system. Won't speak to Haldeman, certainly won't speak to Nixon. And he wants Nixon to testify at the trial because he took the position, he believes throughout, best of his memory, that they should disclose everything, that they were going to go down if they didn't disclose. And it's on the tapes. There's a wonderful tape. I forget which one it is, but we'll hit it when we do next week. And Nixon says to Dean, I suppose it's too late to go the hangout route. And Dean says, yeah, it's too late to do that because it'll lead back to the plumbers. And Nixon says, you know, John always wanted to go the hangout route. Well, how'd you like to be indicted for participation in the cover-up conspiracy and have the president say on tape, he was always for full disclosure? So Ehrlichman really wants Nixon to be his lead defense witness. Nixon doesn't want to come and doesn't end up coming. Gordon Liddy is in jail doing 4 to 20. Jim Magruder has pled guilty to a single felony, a plea deal, sentenced to 10 months to 4 years, and he's in jail. And John Dean has pled to a single felony. Have to be careful now. He sold his house to Lowell Weicker on the Irvin Committee. Why not? He has a house, nice townhouse down in Old Town. Weicker is in a separate townhouse a couple doors up the street, and Weicker's wealthy. He buys Dean's townhouse so Dean can get out of town. And he goes out to Beverly Hills. I think he's still in the same house that he bought when he vacated. But as of September 1st, he's confined to Fort Holabird, Maryland, so he can testify that he's in jail. He's been sentenced to 1 to 4 years incarceration to start the first day of trial. And we know he's going to be released at the end of trial, so's Magruder, but nobody else knows that. So that's where our friends are. Let's now review the fairness of the trial. Our Bill of Rights is very specific about due process of law and being confronted by your accusers and public trials and all that sort of thing. And I boil it down to 4 characteristics of a fair trial. Remember, because I said it, you all agreed that no matter how challenging the defendant, how despicable the defendant, no matter how heinous the crime, in our system, you get a fair trial. Then we hang you. But you get a fair trial, okay? And I say a fair trial, for our purposes, consists of 4 things. A fair and unbiased judge. I said fair and impartial. Nonpartisan prosecutors who are enforcing the law in an equal manner. A jury of your peers that's neither tainted by pretrial publicity nor politically biased against you. And the automatic right to an appeal. In the federal system, you get an automatic right to a circuit rehearing. The appeal to the Supreme Court is discretionary. But no matter what you're convicted of, you have one level of appeal. None of these characteristics were present in the Watergate cover-up trial. And we'll go through some quickly and some of these things slowly because we've covered some and we'll still cover some in upcoming times. So Sirica is a biased judge. He's enamored of his public acclaim. He played to the media. He saw himself as an avenging angel in search of truth. I gave you some articles by Renata Atler and George Higgins about that. He met secretly with prosecutors and other interested parties in advance of trial on at least a dozen occasions to address issues. He reached a secret pact with the prosecutors. And I'm going to bring you the memo next week so you have time to really look at it. The deal, which you can conclude was in that memo, was Sirica wants the indictments to come in time to name himself to be the trial judge. And they want Sirica's approval of sending the roadmap, grand jury information, up to the House Judiciary Committee. And there's this 2-page memo that's been hidden for 40 years that Jaworski wrote that details this meeting and this understanding. And then he temporarily sentences Dean to a harsh prison sentence for the express purpose of increasing his witness credibility. I've been punished. These are my friends. I'm telling you, they were in on it. They should be punished. So let's go through some of those things. We're going to do the Sirica quickly so we can get to some other stuff. These are the pictures of the people we know he met with. The prosecutors are Leon Jaworski at the top, Earl Silbert at the bottom, and Archie Cox over at about 8 o'clock. He met with the head of the Irvin Committee staff, Sam Dash, at 10 o'clock, with Edward Bennett Williams, that was representing the other side, and with Clark Molinoff, who's a good friend of Sirica's and lead investigative reporter and just hates Richard Nixon. And it's very clear Molinoff said, there's a conspiracy. I know there's a conspiracy to cover up. All you got to do is push hard on the break-in trial and you can break it, and nobody else can do that but you. And then Molinoff writes in his books about what a great public service this was. We'll get to some of these, but let's go now to the prosecutors. We're supposed to have nonpartisan, even-handed prosecutors enforcing the law in the same way with everybody. But this group was specially recruited, highly partisan, all Ivy staff. The entire leadership, 17 people, came from the Kennedy-Johnson Department of Justice. And as I told you before, there's a constitutional inversion. The very people voted out of office now are back in power and answerable to nobody except possibly to Senator Kennedy on the Senate Judiciary. They met secretly with the judges. They indicted Republicans but not Democrats for improper and partisan reasons. And in 2 weeks from now, we're going to compare their treatment of Chuck Colson, who's a prominent Republican, to the treatment of Bill Bittman, who was Howard Hunt's lawyer, who was getting the payoffs, who's a prominent Democrat. And I have the stuff, but we're hurrying on for now. They creatively reinterpreted and enforced obsolete laws to secure convictions. They brought civil rights charges in the Plumbers case. Now, it was a burglary. If you don't think they had protection on the burglary, you charge them with burglary. But there's no federal burglary statute. Isn't that intriguing? They just don't do ordinary criminal law. The burglary statute that was violated was out in California, in Los Angeles. And these same people had been indicted for burglary. But the feds went out and said, no, put your case off. We've got a bigger fish to fry. We're going to charge them with violating civil rights. That's never happened. What happens today is you wait for the state or local trial, and if it doesn't work the way you think it should, civil rights down in the South where they kept letting people off, then the feds come in and say, well then, okay, we'll go with our civil rights statutes, but not the reverse, except in Watergate. And the other thing was the Corrupt Practices Act of 1925. What a great name. It was original campaign finance, and it didn't work. So there hadn't been a case brought under this act for 40 years, and the Department of Justice had testified they had a policy of non-enforcement on this law. That's why they needed a new law. The new law had passed. This had been repealed, came into effect on April 7th, so money before April 7th didn't have to be disclosed. Money after had to be. That's why we did the money laundering with the genius Gordon Liddy. But what they did, because the Nixon White House ran a program in 1970, the midterms, giving money to conservatives. And they didn't have a campaign treasurer registered in the district. So they were after Bob Haldeman, and they were after other administration people for a law for violation of a law that hadn't been enforced, 40 years had been repealed, and the Department of Justice had testified they wouldn't bring in enforcement. But the special prosecutor answered to nobody, and they wanted to bring pressure on Republican money people, and they found they could do it this way. They withheld exculpatory information regarding prior inconsistent statements by the crucial witnesses of Dean and Magruder. I told you about the Magruder. We're going to spend some time on Dean next. And Cox met secretly with David Bazelon to stack the deck on appeals. So these are abuses. And we're going to focus on number 5. And it involves John Dean. Remember, he pleaded guilty to a single felony that I think triggered the Saturday Night Massacre. Sentencing was postponed. Once the Vesco acquittals occurred in New York and the jury said they didn't find Dean credible, they hurried up and imposed this harsh sentence on John Dean. That's number 3. But then the prosecutors kept evidence of the changed testimony from defense, and that's what we're going to focus on in just a second. When they did the opening of the cover-up trial, one of the defense lawyers said, listen, you're going to hear from John Dean. John Dean is scared of his prison term, and he's seeking favor from the prosecutors. Judge interrupts. Never interrupt the opening statement. Judge calls him to the bench and says, you can't say that. You can't say that because I've already sentenced him. And the guy says, well, he's still trying to curry favor with him. Nope, you can't say it. I will not let you say that, okay, because I've sentenced him. And then Dean is on the stand. This is the second indent, Dean obfuscation of CIA, FBI. Remember the smoking gun? The smoking gun, Shepard's view, is trying to prevent the names of these 2 contributors from becoming public because it will ruin them. They're Democratic contributors. Dean's on the stand. Dean knows he's the one that suggested this approach to Haldeman. Haldeman's lawyer is cross-examining Dean, trying to get Dean to admit the real purpose of the meeting. And Dean just obfuscates. He won't respond. You know, you're supposed to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Dean knows blessed well what that meeting was about. He writes about it in his book. I gave you the quote in his 2014 book where he says, oh, geez, the lawyers misunderstood if they'd only known. But when he's on the stand under oath and they say, wasn't the purpose to prevent the disclosure? He says, well, they were worried about Gordon Liddy's involvement. It's a non sequitur, but if you're an experienced liar, it just changes the subject. Instead of denying or admitting, you just move on to something else. And the lawyer, not having been there and not being Jeff Shepard, doesn't know enough to nail you. Okay, so then Dean's prison term right after the trial, reduced to time served. He only did 4 months. And then we learn he never spent a day in jail. So imagine if you're Ehrlichman, Haldeman, or Mitchell. Now, they've gone to their grave without knowing this no jail stuff. But imagine if that had become public. Okay, I showed you this slide before, but this is good. This is John Sirica's book on sentencing Dean. I knew what he said on the stand wasn't going to make any difference in the sentence I handed down, so to prevent any suggestion he was testifying in the hope of reducing his sentence, I gave him the sentence well before the trial. Well, it was a month before the trial. And you can't write this in your book if you have to acknowledge you freed him immediately after the trial. That's inconsistent with this statement, says Jeff. The prosecutors are worse. In the prosecutor's book, they take credit for putting Dean in jail before the trial. Moral balancing aside, the real politic of the situation, Dean wouldn't be an effective witness if he got a free ride. The evident effect of Dean's prison sentence on the jurors of the cover-up trial confirmed our tactical judgment. And again, they don't admit that then Dean gets set completely free, but they take credit for this temporary sentence. Okay, now we're going to go to the memo. Happen to have it right here. This memo, I claim, this is what I've worked up to. I've got plenty of time. This, I claim, is the smoking gun in the prosecutor's file. Okay, we're going to spend 5 or 6 slides on this. They removed the Silbert team when Archibald Cox and the new prosecutors came in. And I told you, you lost institutional memory. Those were the career guys who conducted the break-in trial and broke the cover-up. But when it became politicized, they tossed them out. I mean, they didn't fire them from the Department of Justice. They removed them from the case. And the new folks were concerned that those three guys, Silbert, Glanzer, and Campbell, had inadvertently given Dean immunity from prosecution during the month of April because they met or talked with Dean or his lawyer 12 times. And there was a proffer of proof. Here's what Dean will say if you give him immunity. And they said, well, you know, maybe they inadvertently gave Dean immunity. So they assigned two lawyers, Peter Rent and Judy Denny, the responsibility of interviewing these guys about what they did during the month of April. And the interviews of Seymour Glanzer and Doug Campbell occurred during September 18th and October 10th. And each of these guys is working from their detailed notes during their meetings with Schaffer, who's Dean's lawyer, and Dean. Dean enters his guilty plea, because they were working on this at the same time, on October 19th, and the notes are typed up after that. They're typed up on November 15th. But they're based on interviews before Dean reaches his plea, okay? Then they're formalized in this 26-page memo. And what the memo shows is Dean's changed testimony during the month of April. The memo was never shared with defense counsel, as it should have been under the Brady rule, where the prosecutors have to share with the defense if there's exculpatory information. Fair's fair. The prosecutors can't hide stuff from the defense. This is not inconsequential. After the first day of trial, James Neal, the lead prosecutor, says to one of his aides, I need research on allegations of John Dean's changing testimony. I think that's where they're going to base their defense. So I need to have the record stirred up. So this is not an unnoticed question. And then the two lawyers, Rent and Denny, they both signed the brief on appeal after the Watergate convictions. They're two of six lawyers who signed the brief that says we turned over everything that the Brady rule requires. So this isn't something that got hidden in the corner that nobody knew about. This is core to the Watergate prosecution. So we start. This is one of 4 slides. And these are quotes from the Denny Rent memo. And these are the inconsequential quotes, but you can see where we're going. Number 1, Schaffer's initial meetings with the prosecutors were premised on obtaining immunity for Dean, and those meetings were April 2nd, April 5th, and April 6th. What's key is John Dean was saying in public, I just want to tell the truth. I want the truth to come out. I'm a fair witness. But his lawyer is in there saying, we want immunity. We want immunity because we can get you convictions on other people. John will be your witness, but only for immunity, which John Dean is denying in public. On April 6th, this is number 2, this is the first extensive meeting with Charles Schaffer. It's 3 or 4 hours of what can your client tell us? And this is a quote. Schaffer talked only of Dean's knowledge regarding Mitchell and Magruder. There was nothing said about Ehrlichman, Haldeman, Colson, or Nixon. So you start out early in April, the guys aren't even involved. On April 8th, number 3, the first face-to-face meeting, it includes Schaffer, but this is when he produces John Dean. At page 6, the president had not been told everything yet. Page 6 also, Dean told about the January and February meetings in Mitchell's office. That's where they're describing Gordon Liddy's crazy plan. But didn't tell about the hiring of Liddy or talking with Liddy before the January meeting. Dean is coming in looking for immunity, but he's not describing his role. He's hiding his role vis-a-vis Gordon Liddy. The third dot point. Dean did not mention his subsequent meeting with Haldeman at this time. He gave no information at all about Haldeman or Ehrlichman. They're absent. Now, the Haldeman meeting is where he comes back from the February 4th meeting and says that this Liddy plan is nuts. I don't want anything to do with it. But he didn't mention he had that meeting with Haldeman in a 4 or 5 hour meeting with the prosecutors. And then finally, the fourth dot point under number 3, Dean admitted cross-examining Magruder for his grand jury appearances and suggested weaknesses in Magruder's testimony. This is subornation of perjury. Okay? He rehearses Magruder knowing Magruder's going to perjure himself. And here he's admitting that he did that. Okay? So we know he did it. And then you go to the second extensive meeting of the prosecutors with John Dean on April 9th. Quote, Dean did not mention the cover-up until later. So prosecutors didn't understand Dean's references to money other than that money was to pay Hunt's requests conveyed by O'Brien. O'Brien's a lawyer for Creep that's presenting Hunt's demand for $120,000. Second one, Schaffer said Dean had nibbled on the $15,900 that Howard and Strawn had given him. This is campaign funds, having taken about $4,000 for his honeymoon, put a check in the safe. This is Dean admitting that he's embezzled $4,000. So Shepard didn't make this up out of nowhere. It's in the prosecutor's notes. And then on the 15th, the third dot under 4, at this point the prosecutors began to think of Dean as a defendant rather than a witness. Dean comes running in saying, I can get you Mitchell, I can get you Magruder, and he starts telling his story and they keep asking him some questions and they don't like the answers they're getting. So Dean is starting to feel the heat. And in his own book, Blind Ambition, there's a page, and he says to his lawyer, I don't want to talk to those bastards anymore. And his lawyer says, listen, John, they think you're guilty. You're going to have to start talking conspiracy. And then about 2 paragraphs later, not right in the same paragraph, but 2 paragraphs later, Dean says, you know, I'm starting to like this conspiracy idea. And Shepard's view, I don't want this to be lost on you, is he comes in saying, I can give you Mitchell and Magruder on the original plan, and it doesn't work. And his lawyer says, the only way you can save yourself is to become a witness in a conspiracy of more senior people. Then they'll have to deal with you, okay? So we go to April 15th, the bottom one, number 5. Glanzer thinks Dean discussed receiving 302s from Gray. Gray's the head of the FBI. To keep abreast of the news leaks, Dean didn't mention he'd previously requested them from Peterson and Kleindingst and had been turned down. This is his leakage of prosecutorial information, that 302s are the raw FBI interview files that he got sweet-talking out of Pat Gray, and it was sharing with defense counsel. So remember, I told you Dean had done a bunch of stuff over and above mere obstruction of justice, subornation of perjury, embezzlement, and now improper sharing of prosecutorial information. We go to slide 2. Notice the print gets bigger because we're focusing more on this, okay? This is same April 9th, second extensive meeting with Dean. Quote, Dean never acknowledged a cover-up or conspiracy or paying the defendants for silence until after he was fired. And he's fired on April 30th. So you've got the guy coming in, I got a story, you got to hear my story. And then when the story doesn't take, the story changes. Okay? Dean said at some point Parkinson and LaRue had come to his office with a sheet of paper for money that Hunt wanted. This is the second bullet in red. But Dean never said the money was for Hunt's silence. And then Campbell remembers that Dean told of the March 21st meeting, that's the cancer on the presidency speech, where Dean attempted to tell the president about the situation, but the president didn't understand. Here you have Dean saying, I tried to tell him. Now we know from the tape, he doesn't tell him about his own criminal involvement. He says, well, you know, Strawn's in trouble, Chapin's in trouble, Magruder may have perjured himself, Hunt's demanding money. But Dean's story is never relayed to the president. Okay? So this is getting better. Now we go to number 3. May 1st, big type. By the end of April, Dean had become much more antagonistic toward Haldeman and Ehrlichman in his discussions with the prosecutors and in public. Before that, the impression he gave of Haldeman was of a great devoted public servant, clean and hardworking. He had been restrained in his praise of Ehrlichman. So on May 1st, he gets around to knifing his 2 superiors in the back, having skipped it for the whole month of April. So this is in the typed memo. And when I did my first book, I reproduced this whole memo in the appendix. And then I came across the handwritten notes from this same entry. And the next slide is not from the typed memo, it's from the notes from Judy Denny when she's taken notes. And read this. May 2nd, May 3rd, situation in state of flux because the Senate committee, that's the Irvin Committee and Cox, being appointed. Dean becomes antagonistic to Ehrlichman and Haldeman, whereas before he'd given the impression that Haldeman was clean and was restrained as to E's involvement. Haldeman was clean. Not clean and hardworking, a devoted public servant, but Haldeman was clean. Okay? Now, how'd you like to have that in your hand when John Dean is testifying that Haldeman was in the cover-up from the beginning? You do what's called, you impeach the witness with his own words. Now, when a witness changes their story in the hands of prosecutors, it's got to be disclosed to the defendants. This is huge, but even within their own office, they couldn't stand the real notes. So they doctored it in the typed written memo. Final slide. Final slide on the smoking gun. We switch to President Nixon. And this is the entry on May 3rd. Dean began focusing on presidential involvement, thus dramatically changing his previous stance. You couldn't dictate better words than proof of a witness changing their testimony. And this memo was hidden, kept hidden from the defense counsel. Okay, let's recap because I haven't kicked it quite hard enough. Dean had run the cover-up. He's the only witness that could connect Haldeman and Ehrlichman to his actions. Schaffer approached the career prosecutor seeking immunity in exchange for testimony against Mitchell and Magruder. They concluded Dean was criminally involved. They wouldn't grant him immunity. He got immunity in the first place from the Irvin Committee, not from the prosecutors, not till the political guys came in. Dean's story changed from nailing Mitchell and Magruder to one focusing on conspiracy. The change is fully documented. In the memo, it was required to be shared with defense counsel. The document would have allowed defense counsel to impeach Nixon. And the failure to share this memo was not an oversight. This is what Neal was concerned with at the first day of trial, and these two lawyers were senior enough, they were 2 of 6 lawyers on the brief. So this is not insignificant, this is huge. Okay, other examples of Dean's evolving stories, I have 5 minutes. He said at one point that he'd warned Haldeman about the Liddy plan after the meeting of February 4th. And that grows from, well, I warned him, I mentioned it, to Haldeman was supposed to shut it off. And the prosecutors say, see, that's when Dean dropped out of the conspiracy. And Haldeman, honest, to the end of the day, he says, you know, I have no memory of this. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm saying I have no memory. But in his book, after he's been convicted, he says, you know, I thought it over and I thought it over. I don't think that meeting ever occurred. I think Dean's lying. Dean says in his many multitudes of statements that he's recalled from Manila, where he's given a speech on drug abuse, because of the break-in. And he's sitting next to a guy on the airplane coming back from Manila, and they talk about making plans to go to dinner when they get to San Francisco, that, you know, Dean's got all the time in the world, he doesn't have to hurry back for anything. One of my good friends, Pete Velde, was in the room in the Hilton Hotel in Manila when John Dean got the phone call saying, get your ass back here. Dean was supposed to give the keynote speech at this drug conference, hurries out of there, and Pete had to give the keynote address. So this nonsense about there was no hurry when I was called back, I was going to go out to dinner with this good friend in San Francisco, it's all starting a cover-up. Dean's already starting to place things to try to protect himself. At one point, Dean brags to Chuck Colson that Hunt has been sent out of the country right after the break-in. His family's in Europe, he's been sent away. And Colson said, good Lord, you can't do that. That's obstruction of justice. So Dean said, oh, well, I'll get it turned off. And then he starts saying it was Ehrlichman's idea. And the prosecutors are going, well, we're going to nail Ehrlichman for obstruction. And they get to Colson, and Colson said it was never mentioned in that meeting, he says, occurred with Ehrlichman. And Ehrlichman says, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't do that. And Dean is left, and Dean gets in the notes, the prosecutor's notes, he gets very upset that he's been caught, that nobody will back up his changing story. Number 4, he says he's never been asked to prepare a Dean report. He was asked to prepare 2, one right after the break-in, to tell Ehrlichman and Haldeman, the president, if anybody in the White House staff was involved. And we were worried about Colson. Colson was nuts. And he says, no, Colson wasn't involved. He doesn't mention himself. But that was the first Dean report. It wasn't written, but it was sure a report. And then on March 22nd, after the Cancer and the Presidency meeting, the whole meeting is devoted to the idea Dean's going to go to Camp David. He's going to write a report. The president's going to use the report as his basis for calling for a new investigation. And Dean is out in public saying, no, never happened. Don't never asked. The gambit on the smoking gun. Tell you how we shut off the FBI investigation. We'll get the CIA, tell the FBI, stay out of this. He says when he presents it to Haldeman that it's John Mitchell's idea and Dean's thought about it and Dean agrees. But it's been shown, one by James Rosen and 2 by Len Kolodny in the transcripts, Dean never spoke to Mitchell. We know exactly what was going on, who was talking to whom. This stuff's all recorded. I mean, the fact a phone call occurred is recorded. He never talked to Mitchell. He made this up. Made it in order to make it sound like it came from somebody else. In the books, Maureen Biner, his wife, she has a book about being a Watergate wife. And he writes about, the uncertainty in their romantic relationship, and John just wouldn't propose, and she went away, and she came back, and wasn't this romantic. And finally, Dean came around, and life was good. Dean proposed to Maureen Biner the day his final divorce came through from his previous wife. I mean, that's just open and shut. All the rest is just nonsense. It just gets made up again and again and again. I'm on number 7. He did tell Fred LaRue that Hunt was demanding $120,000. And the problem was LaRue and Dean had different memories. Dean had already testified under oath that that conversation occurred on Wednesday night and was on the phone. And LaRue said, no, it occurred Thursday morning and it was face-to-face. And this was a critical element of nailing Richard Nixon. So Dean's testimony just changes. He says, well, I said this, but the better story is that. He's meeting with the prosecutor's needs. More recently, and look at number 8, we jump up 30 years. He teaches ethics seminars. And what he says in those, he says, I knew there was a cover-up, but I couldn't tell there was a cover-up because of attorney-client privilege. He's got some nutty law professor who was in my class at Harvard to say, oh, yes, attorney-client, much as Dean wanted to say something, attorney-client privilege prevented him from doing that as a good lawyer. There is no attorney-client privilege in a government employee. You represent the office. You don't represent the person. I mean, this is nonsense, absolute nonsense. And finally, his most recent, this is 2012, but it's still recent. Now he's telling people that he really wasn't convicted of a crime in Watergate. That's all a misunderstanding. He was placed in a witness protection program like it happened magically, and he didn't plead to a felony. John Dean is a convicted felon sentenced to 1 to 4 years in prison and disbarred from the practice of law for 40 years. But he would have people believe today that he was put in witness protection and nothing more. This is a strange guy. Okay. Third, remember, biased judge, improper practices by the prosecutor, tainted and politically biased jury pool. I'm 2 minutes over, but I don't care. I'm almost through. This is important. The pretrial publicity was not unlike today. Okay? It was 85% negative. It went on for 2 years. That affects a jury pool. In fact, in the dissent on the appeal, the opening sentence in the dissent says, if ever in the history of our country there was a criminal case which by law had to be transferred to another place for trial because of prejudicial pretrial publicity alone, this is that case. Get it out of the district. Court wouldn't hear of it. The jury pool, I'm not talking about the jurors, I don't know who they were, but the pool they were drawn from was politically biased because the District of Columbia is so Democratic that even in Nixon's landslide reelection, 80% of the vote was against him. And you have one of the prosecutors in their books saying, our greatest fear in the jury was we might get some rock-ribbed Republican. Well, there were thousands, millions of them across the great nation. There were just none in the district. And then it's not anything close to a jury of your peers. The cover-up jury was 2/3 black, 3/4 female, and predominantly blue-collar. And the law didn't know how to deal with this. If there were systematic discrimination, it would deal with it. Blacks kept off the jury, that's not a fair jury. But in the district, it's just a fact of life. And for a complicated cover-up trial, you'd hope you'd get a different jury than the one that they got. And they might have gotten a different jury if they had gone to Baltimore or Richmond. They had opinions, surveys taken. Those people had ordinary lives. They weren't fixated. Okay. I'm going to stop after this one because it's no fair. TV cameras aren't allowed into the federal courts. This is a sketch done by John Ehrlichman. John used to love to doodle. So this is his sketchbook. And he sketched the trial. Okay? And this is they're examining a potential juror. So the person way up front, seated in the jury box, is being asked questions about whether they're biased or not. And this is a left-handed courtroom. The judge is in the center and the jury are the 12 empty seats off to the left. Normally on TV you see the opposite. But what's so interesting is the prosecutors have a table for 7 that's closest to the jury, which is normal. And then each of the 5 defendants is at a separate table, 2 lawyers and one defendant. And the result, I was going to wear a Mad Hatter's Tea Party hat today, but my wife said I couldn't do that. It becomes a circus because every single witness is cross-examined by 5 different attorneys with different points of view. It's a 3-month trial. You start the trial and you say, okay, now when we let the guy in, the 61st guy, he came in at 1:45. Okay? And then you go on to a whole bunch of other stuff. And now your only purpose of calling a particular person is to testify the clock said 1:45. But you can't stop the trial and say to the jurors, now you remember when I told you that it occurred at 1:45? That's the only purpose this person's coming in here for. You can't do that. So you just keep walking through this maze for 3 months. And each defense lawyer is trying to bring out some different aspect. Was it an electric clock? Was it a digital clock? Was it raining outside? They're trying to obfuscate, and throw sand in the gears. And the prosecutor has a hugely complicated case because while only 2 or 3 overt acts, 5 or 6 overt acts apply to Ehrlichman or Haldeman or Mitchell, they got all these witnesses they're trying to run through to prove there was wrongdoing. And then they're going to add these guys as a part of it. I'm going to stop there. I got a lot more. But I'm going to stop there and take your questions. Ma'am.
You said several of the men went to their graves never knowing that Dean didn't serve any time. Where did Dean go?
No. Dean was set free after 4 months of confinement. They went to their graves not knowing that the 4 months involved no jail time whatsoever. Okay. He didn't go to jail. He was sentenced to 1 to 4 years in prison.
He never spent a day in jail.
That's correct. That's the point.
Okay.
And then later it comes out, well, I had conjugal visits. I was driven downtown to work on my book. I really wasn't convicted of a crime. I was in witness protection.
So they thought he was in jail 4 months, and that was it. That's all he got.
That's all he got. The public didn't much care. The other thing they really didn't know, went to their graves, was these memos in Jaworski's confidential file, and we're going to do them in two more sessions, where he writes down and describes his secret meetings with Judge Sirica. I mean, that to me is just beyond the pale. You talk about not getting a fair trial. When one side's meeting secretly with a judge, it doesn't balance well. Other questions? Sir.
Just as a generality, what couldn't the defense ask, was there anybody else that you talked to? Because if you lied about it, then you would have perjured yourself.
Are you asking, the question is, how come the defense couldn't bring this stuff out in trial?
Right.
Dean's testimony or Sirica's?
Dean's testimony. Because there are a couple of things that he
I have in my possession the depositions taken after Len Kolodny's book, Silent Coup, came out and John Dean sued. And there's 8 hours of the defense lawyers trying to nail Dean. And they just can't do it. He's just, it's just easy. Conrad Black says he's the most slippery of the Watergate defendants. He's an extraordinarily accomplished liar. You get the impression he's done it all his life. He could pass lie detector tests. And he just, you may or may not like Bill Clinton, but Bill Clinton has the same ability of just shifting a nuanced meaning, and you don't realize you didn't get an answer. So it's difficult, but you would think we could get him. Haven't been successful so far.
How come, you said a couple of times that it was an unfair jury pool because it was in D.C. and it was desired to be moved to Baltimore or Richmond.
Right.
Why would they have been so advantageous? I mean, this was
Well, D.C., yeah. Have you ever lived in the district?
No.
Okay. No, it's okay. Good for you. The question is, why was D.C. so unique from the nation? Why would moving it?
That's not my point. Not what they were. Why were they? Why was Baltimore or Richmond so much better?
Well, I'll tell you. No, I'm not arguing with you. D.C. is a diamond 10 miles on a side. You can't walk more than 5 miles without crossing a state line. And if you cross the state line, you go into the Fourth Circuit. The Fourth Circuit is much more conservative than Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is a one-industry town. Everybody is involved in politics all the time. And this was the dominant story, particularly in newsprint. There were 52,000 column inches on Watergate. Now, people in Baltimore, people in Richmond, they have lives. And they did surveys. They presented to the court on appeal surveys, it's not proof, but it's an indication, that said that the people didn't follow Watergate on a daily basis as much as they did in the district. Let me get you one quote if I can, because I skipped it, but this gives me the right. Okay, this is from John Ehrlichman's sketchbook, so it's John speaking, okay? During my first trial, I began to realize the near impossibility of drawing a D.C. jury that had not been tainted by the local media and the daily barrage of Sam Ervin's Senate committee and Peter Rodino's House impeachment deliberations. D.C., like most major urban centers, draws jury panels from its predominantly black population. Prospective jurors were of two varieties. Some had read and watched almost everything about Watergate, had formed very firm opinions that we were all guilty of everything, but desperately wanted to be on a Watergate jury. They pretended they either knew very little or they could be objective. The second variety of juror was genuinely uninformed, uneducated, and incapable of following a long, complex trial. And big fights over what's called voir dire when you check out the jurors. The judge made sure no one would criticize his jury selection process until after it was too late to make any difference. He gagged the lawyers, ordering them not to say anything to the press throughout the trial, and then he put the court stenographer's transcripts under seal so no one could read about what happened while the press and the public were excluded from the selection of the jury. What he's doing when he's questioning the jurors, they keep saying these people are guilty. And he keeps saying, answer my question. Don't tell me what you've concluded. I want to know if there's anything about this particular trial that troubles you. And the people would pause, and he'd say, well, see? And if somebody said, no, I've been watching this, I cut out newspaper clippings. You know, I got a scrapbook on this case. And he would say, well, yeah, but can you be objective? Do you think you can be? And the minute that question was asked and answered in front of the pool, everybody knew the correct answer if they wanted to be on the jury. Now, some didn't want to be on the jury, and they'd say these folks are guilty as hell. And they kept trying to prevent them from saying that. So when they took the appeal, and they keep quoting from these transcripts, but they were sealed from your vision. You can have a different opinion. It's perfectly all right. People disagree with me all the time. I don't mind. Other questions? Sir?
Explain to me again Judy Rent's role, or Rent, or whatever, her role. The prosecutor's notes were her notes, but she hand wrote some into the actual prosecutor's.
Well, it's Peter Rent and Judy Denny. It's okay. I think Judy is much less senior. I can't find her. I think she got married or something, changed her name. But she's, as the least senior of the two, she's taking notes during these interviews of Cy Glanzer and Doug Campbell. And she's writing them down. We have them. And then from that, they type up what I call the smoking gun. And what they're trying to do is be sure these career prosecutors didn't give away the store when they were interviewing Dean and Schaffer. But a byproduct of they go through each day, you know, what happened in this meeting, what happened in this meeting. A byproduct of that effort is this documentation of Dean's story changing.
That's what I wanted to. So it's a byproduct of what they.
That's correct. And I've not found a memo that says, what are we going to do with this memo? I haven't found that. The one about ex parte meetings on the mandamus effort, kicking Sirica off, we want a evidentiary hearing on these meetings. How would you respond if you were the prosecutors and you knew there had been all these meetings? What do you say? And the answer is they said nothing. They just stood mute. They didn't take the issue on. They didn't express an opinion because that would have dug them in deeper. But you could, if you were as aggressive as I, you could say, well, to the court, you owe a 15B standard. You can't leave out facts necessary to make the truth known. And you had defendants on trial for their lives, I mean, euphemistically, begging to know if the judge had met with the prosecutors. The prosecutors knew they'd been meeting. It was discussed at the senior staff meetings, and they didn't tell the court. Other? Well, if you're going to stand silent, I'm going to read you more stuff. Okay. Sirica, this is good. Stick around. Now, we got a few minutes. Sirica and the press. Again, from John Ehrlichman's sketchbook. So you got to take it with a grain of salt. During the cover-up trial, a friend of mine who was a federal judge in a faraway state, John's from Washington State, dropped in to watch for a few minutes, and then he went to Sirica's chambers to pay a courtesy call during a recess. He was dumbfounded to find Sirica at his desk hosting a coffee clatch with Mary McGrory and a half dozen other reporters. She's the lead political reporter for the Washington Post. The journalists were criticizing several of the rulings Sirica had made during that day's session, and it became clear Sirica was on the defensive, listening intently. The judge nodded, agreeing with the criticism. To pacify his guests, he'd straighten things out later, he promised. My friend, next paragraph. My friend left with the opinion that Mary and the others were manipulating Sirica and that he was permitting them to do so. From the beginning of the trial, we'd watched him being led around by the attorneys for the prosecution. But at least in open court, what they did was on the record. But the realization that our none too bright judge, he's careful, our none too bright judge had turned over his judgment to Mary McGrory and company had truly sinister connotations. And then the third paragraph. I didn't leave anything out. This is just straight. Sirica announced one day that the defendant's objections to the introduction of certain prosecution evidence would be overruled. You may be technically correct, he ruled, but in this case the rules of evidence don't apply. Sirica seemed oblivious to the consternation his statement caused in the courtroom. But when the Washington Post and the Washington Evening Star sternly criticized him the next day, he spent about a half hour of court time, of course the jury's taken away, trying to explain away his apparent indifference to the rules of evidence. Then he tried to correct the record. The influence of the press on John Sirica cannot be overstated. I mean, the guy's, you'll forgive me, he's very, very inept. I want to finish, because you're being very kind in indulging me. The fourth lack of due process was the deck was stacked on appeals. Sirica's the most reverse judge in the D.C. Circuit, mainly for define defendants' rights. Prosecutor met with Judge Bazelon to stack the deck. The mandamus petition was rejected just like that. All 12 appeals from Sirica were heard sua sponte en banc, and his rulings. What's so intriguing is at the same time Judge Gazelle is hearing Watergate cases, also the Plumbers trial and Dwight Chapin's perjury trial, and his appeals are heard by a normal 3-judge panel because they're not worried about his problems on appeal. Only Sirica's are heard by this jury-rigged sua sponte en banc. Let's take a brief look at David Bazelon. This is his picture. We argued all these things on appeal. It didn't make any difference, but we didn't know of his ex parte meetings, his Brady violations, Dean's disappearing prison sentence, and Cox's ex parte meeting. Again, the best sources are the appellate briefs. Bazelon is such an interesting guy. There's no heroes in Watergate. He's chief judge of the D.C. Circuit. He went on the circuit in 1949. Before that, he had been in charge of the Office of Alien Property at the Department of Justice. And the job was to dispose of the assets seized from Germans and Japanese in World War II. And the accusation in this fantastic book called Super Mob, over there on the side, is that Sirica's boyhood friends and roommates were part of the Jewish mafia, and that what he was doing was alerting them to properties that were coming up, hotels and other real estate, where there weren't any bidders. So they could get it almost for nothing. And then later, miraculously, when he's out of office, when he's on the bench, they say, well, you know, he really owned 5% or 10% of that deal. And the money, when they sell the hotel, flows the other way. Now, there's an FBI investigation of this. I got the Freedom of Information Act. And they really go into it. And there's this great quote. They don't indict him. There's this great quote where Bazelon says, I would have been indicted if I didn't get this appointment to the federal court. And he's appointed by Truman, but it's a recess appointment, so there's no full field investigation. And there he is. The other thing, just to mention, because it's my second to the last slide, there's a book that seems to be unrelated, A Justice for All by Kim Eisler, that's about Justice Brennan, who took Earl Warren's place as the most liberal justice on the Supreme Court during this time. And there's just tremendously interesting references to Bazelon, whom this author says is the most dangerous man in America because the circuit court is still so liberal and it feeds to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court either lets the circuit court opinion stand or extends it. And he talks about Bazelon setting out to become Brennan's friend. Every Saturday they went for long walks together. They started investing in real estate together. And you may remember that we drove Fortis off the bench for taking money on the side. Turns out William O. Douglas, Brennan, Bazelon, and J. Skelly Wright, who was on the D.C. Circuit, were all investing in real estate properties in Virginia together under Bazelon's leadership. And you begin to, you say, well, that may have been all right when nobody was looking, but you start looking at that stuff, and that you begin to get the impression there are improper financial relationships. There, okay, I'm done. Now, don't forget, we're 5 minutes early. Do you want to wait for a joke? I'll give you a joke. Okay, okay, good. Look at this. This is really cool. This is a picture of the cabinet room, okay? And Nixon's in the center, and this is the leadership. This is the Republican leadership. Every other week, we bring up the GOP, Hugh Scott and others. Every other one of those, we bring up both. So there's a constant interaction with the Congress, but the Republicans get to come more often. So you're sitting in the cabinet room, the president's there, Jerry Ford's across, okay? If you're cool, if you're on the staff, you're not supposed to be in the pictures, okay? You're out of the pictures, except for these 4 guys behind the president. That's the Congressional Relations staff. So if you take a picture of the president, you pick them up, Bill Timmons or Tom Korologos or Ken Kachigian. And what they can do is they give a picture to Hugh Scott. Here's your meeting with the White House, you know, in July. And they're in the picture because they're behind the president and they speak for the president. I was the staff guy in something that was going to be discussed at the meeting. So appropriately, because I was a good guy, I sat on the other side of the room. Now, the press comes in through here. President sits there. So if you sit behind him, you're going to be in the picture. But if you sit back there, you're not going to be. So look on the far left. That's me, okay? Out of the picture, all right? What I didn't think of was when Nixon looked up, he looked at me. Because I'm sitting there right, I mean, I'm not at the table, Lord knows, but I'm back of the table. He's got nothing better to do. So he starts talking about what a fine lawyer I am. I mean, really talking about it. And it goes back again and again. And the guy right behind the president, you almost see him outlined in the window. Tom Korologos starts taking notes, and he calls it leader news on this February 2nd. And then afterwards, he gives me the notes. So here are the notes, okay? Okay. Leader news, Shepard's star rises enormously. See the paragraph sign? That's president. President, Harlow, Ashe, Bush, all leaders praise Shepard 40 times. Class A car, now likely for Shepard. I'm going down the right column. You get 2 kinds of cars, 2 kinds of company cars. A Class B car, once you get to work, they'll give you a ride to the Hill. I need a car to go to the Hill, you know, so. But Class A, they pick you up at home. So there's no chance of being, you know, if you're out at parties, there's no chance of drunk driving. You can work in the car. There's very few people who get a Class A car. I'm going to get a Class A car. Timmons, who's head of Congressional Relations, who really did it, worked on this bill, totally rebuffed. May lose car. Shepardized Timmons' office, too. Timmons stalks out of meeting. Nobody notices or glances at him. Then comes the good one. Down at the bottom. Shit calls set record. Picture this. You're in a 10 o'clock meeting with the President of the United States. They're serving coffee like there was no tomorrow, little Philippine stewards around, okay? You gotta go to the bathroom. You don't want to get up and walk out of a meeting with the President. Bad enough you'd walk out during the Q&A. You don't want to walk out, but you got to. So they're making notes of who has to leave, okay? So it's Bennett, Aarons, and Timmons. And then on the other side, Hartman, that's Jerry Ford's staff guy. Hartman attends first meeting, takeover now imminent, complete confusion reigns in meeting. President announces the veto of postcard registration, except he says resignation, okay? Korologos Max like to shit when President makes Freudian slip on resignation. And then he shows 2 polls. These are surveys, polls for Nixon. Everybody dumps on Brock. That's Bill Brock's proposal for postcard registration. GOP problem, how to cope with COPE. COPE is the union's Committee on Political Education. And this is a stitch, but It really was embarrassing as can be because Nixon just kept going on and on. I don't know where we get lawyers this bright. The guy works all the time. Look at all this fine work. And again, he must have been taking up time or something. Thaning you for coming. This has been fun.
This is going to be amazing.